Hello, my name is Jackie Geringer McDermott, and we are recording live from the English Valleys History Center in North English, Iowa on November 23rd, 2024. This diary or journal was written by my great-great-aunt, Mary Elizabeth Claypool Wade, who was known as Libby Wade. She was my grandmother's aunt and the matriarch of our very, very large family. Libby lived a half a block east of Main Street in a little house on Oak Street in North English, Iowa until near the end of her life in 1959. I don't remember her, but she knew me as a baby. Downtown North English was also the center of my life as I grew up. I would like to introduce you, page by page, to the cast of characters from North English, Iowa. And I'd also like you to bear with me this morning. I've had asthma all week, so I might cough. Here's a picture of Libby. This was about 4 years after this diary started, in the summer of 1949 with her great-granddaughter Barbara Ann Wade, in the front yard of her son Wayne, or Perky Wade's home on East Clark Street, just behind Elwood Law Offices on Main Street. Notice the large trees near the street. Further down the street in those little houses is where my great-grandma Tracy Kelly Geringer Wallace lived about 70 years ago. She was friends with Libby too. January 21st, 1946. Very cold. Harold was here for dinner. Jenny and Belva went to Kelowna to the chiropractor. Lyle drove the car. Lyle was Lyle Furman, a friend of the family. Harold Stubb Wade was her grandson, who was home on leave for the service for 30 days. He's the one on the right side of this picture. I'm over by my fingers. Jenny was Libby's daughter-in-law, the wife of her son, Wayne. Belva Wade Yoss was the daughter of Wayne and Jenny, so she was Libby's granddaughter. Here is an article and a picture from almost 13 years later, in December 1958, when Libby was presented a 60-year pin from the Rebecca Lodge by her three older granddaughters, Hazel Wade Cobb, Evelyn Wade Kurtz, and Belva Wade Yoss. And the story that goes with it says, Mrs. Libby Wade was recently received a 60-year jewel from the Rebecca Lodge. She is shown wearing the pin just after it was presented to her by her three granddaughters, left to right, Mrs. Hazel Cobb, Mrs. Evelyn Kurtz, and Mrs. Belva Yoss. On Thursday afternoon, December 18th, and this would have been 1958, a group of relatives and friends met at the home of Mrs. Libby Wade to honor her and present her with a 60-year jewel from the Iowa Rebecca Lodge number 355. The pin was presented by her three granddaughters, Mrs. Belva Yoss, Mrs. Evelyn Kurtz, and Mrs. Glenn Cobb. Mrs. Wade joined the Green Valley Rebecca Lodge number 397 at Green Valley in November of 1898. The Green Valley Lodge disbanded in 1920 and merged with the North English Lodge number 355. Mrs. Wade held the office of Noble Grand both at Green Valley and North English and was very active in the lodge until the last few years when her poor health kept her from attending. Those present when Mrs. Wade was presented the jewel were Bonnie Wilkerson, Ione Johnson, Jenny Wade, Minnie Moffett, Sadie Wetherill, Alba Humphrey, Leona Humphrey, Lottie Bucher, Alice Van Nocken, Arlene Carter, Gladys Bell, Belva Yoss and Scotty, Hazel Cobb and Mary, and Evelyn Kurtz. Carl Hogendorn came to the home and took pictures of Mrs. Wade and the three granddaughters. Coffee and cookies were served to the guests. January 22, 1946. Below zero this morning, warmer in the p.m. Booster class met with Mrs. Newberry. I didn't go. cold, and I have been having gall trouble. Uncle Frank Warner was taken to Iowa City Hospital, pneumonia. Lodged tonight. Isla Mae Hedrick lost twin boys, premature birth. Booster class was a church group. Mrs. Newberry was Clara Newberry. She was a neighbor and the grandmother of Marlene Newberry, who married my Uncle Marvin Geringer. There's a picture of her on this side, this picture here. Their son, my cousin Stan Geringer, told me he loves my broadcasts. Isla Mae Hedrick was a cousin on Libby Claypool's side of the family, and they lived north of town. She was a sister of Leroy Claypool, a longtime North English resident. Frank Warner, who Libby called Uncle Frank Warner, although he was not related to her, I think she was calling him that as a respectful name. Sometimes people did that in the olden days, call somebody uncle. Frank was a really respectable person around this area. He was the great-grandfather of Carolyn Warner Elwood, who was very active at the English Valley History Center. She and her brother Lloyd Warner were the fifth-generation owners of the Warner farm. Carolyn and her cousin Diane, who comes to the History Center for many of the programs, both remember Frank Warner. Here's a picture of him. Oops, put it this correct way. Carolyn remembers that he bounced her on his knee and called her Posy like the flower. He was a free thinker, well, more along the atheist lines, and very well respected and very smart. Carolyn remembers that he bounced her on her knee and calls her Posy, and Frank lived in the house where Gary and Sharon Kolosik live now, at the corner of College and Clark Streets. Frank's parents were pioneer ancestors to Iowa County, Josiah and Sally Bramer Warner. His aunt was Anna M. Bramer Carter Raines. This is her. She is my ancestor, my first Carter ancestor in Iowa County. So that is how Carolyn Elwood and I are related distantly, very distantly. A little bit more about Frank Warner. I thought he was really an interesting guy. I'm going to have to hold it. This isn't going to work. There he is, and then I'll read it. Frank Rupert Warner, son of Josiah and Sally Ann Bramer Warner, were born in LaSalle County, Illinois on September 22nd, 1862, the fourth of five children. The Josiah Warner family moved from Illinois to Iowa in 1868 and settled on a farm 5 miles east of North English. This farm became the Frank Warner Farm after his marriage on December 25, 1881, to Alvaretta Evans. Here they reared their two sons, Jasper and Earl, and an adolescent niece, Edith Pettibone, Mrs. Kurt Brubaker, after the death of her own mother, Ellen Warner Pettibone. This same farm became the home of each of the Warner sons in turn. Most of Frank Warner's later years were spent in North English. His wife and both sons preceded him in death. Jasper in 1923, Allie his wife in 1943, and Earl the younger son in 1949. His own death came after a period of decline at his home in North English on July 24, 1952. He lived almost 90 years and had seen many changes. In his youth, marketing was done in Iowa City with a team and a wagon. Shorter distances were accomplished on foot when the mud was too deep for a wheeled vehicle. Business trip to Marengo and back on foot were a commonplace event. Frank Warner was a good friend and a good neighbor, a man of many sterling qualities. He commanded the respect and esteem of all who knew him. And then it tells about all of his descendants, of course, and one of them is Dr. Emery Warner from Iowa City. We're going to learn more about him in another podcast. Carolyn and Lloyd Warner, which would be Carolyn Elwood now, were the fourth and fifth generations of the Warners to live on the old farmstead east of North English. I just thought that was a really interesting thing that after I learned about him, Carolyn sent me this picture of him, and then I got on the newspapers and found more about him. That's part of what I'm trying to say is how we learn to research stuff. January 23, 1946. Cloudy and warmer, 40 degrees at 10 a.m. Colder with a strong northwest wind. Temperature dropped to near zero during the night. Some snow fell, but only about 2 inches. January 24th, 1946. Clear and cold. Russell is planning a trip to Orange, Texas to take Keith Harris's family there. He is in the Army. Keith Harris was the son of Delpha and Price Harris and a brother of Lynn Harris, who was a longtime North English resident. January 25th, 1946. Marion and Roy were here. They gave me Kathleen's address. What he's talking about here is Marion, this one, and her dad, Roy Claypool. That would be her nephew. He was the son of her brother, Werner, or Vernie, and her sister-in-law, Minnie Claypool. Marion was Roy's daughter, who had just been discharged from the United States Coast Guard as a seaman first class, serving from October of 1943 to January 1946. Kathleen was another daughter who was still in the service. This is Kathleen here. Kathleen returned home from the service and married and lived in the Watchyer area. Her sister Elna is over here, and she married and moved out of state. Sister Artis married Paul Weber and was the mother of David Weber, Nancy Weber Feeker, Cindy Weber, Bill Weber, Peggy Weber, Andy Weber, Carol Weber Egnall, Mary Weber, Joe Weber, and Laura Weber Hahn, who were all English Valley students. I knew these people. I would stop down and visit them when I was young. And the pictures of all the girls were hanging on the wall, and the 3 oldest girls were in their military outfits. I always thought that was very interesting. Roy Wallace was taken to Marengo Hospital. Lena went along, and Judy stayed with me. Roy was operated on this PM. Both girls stayed with me. Roy Wallace was her daughter-in-law, Lena Wade's father. Lena and Warren, or Mike Wade as we call him, their 2 daughters were Phyllis Wade Peters and Judy Wade Esslinger. Bill Weber from Riverside, formerly of Kinross, writes, I like listening to you and learning more about our Claypool relatives. I have also heard from his sister Cindy Weber, brother Andy Weber, and other locals, including Cindy McCombs, Jane Ackerman, and Janice Semler. Alan Ackerman said that someone stopped him at the school play and said they heard his name on the podcast. I also heard from our old friend Jim Roller, who lives in Arkansas, who said I did an awesome job. Also, when I was doing some of this, I actually went to the newspaper articles that they call personals or locals or whatever you want to name them. They were just a column that they would run they ran them in the Marengo paper, the Williamsburg paper, and the North English paper, and they were just about stuff that was going on this week. And 4 of the things that Libby wrote about were actually in the paper. And I just thought it was really neat to see more ways to back up what we're learning about. On Friday morning, Roy Wallace was taken to the hospital in Marengo where an emergency operation was performed. His condition is critical. And then another article about Marion Claypool, S1R of the Spars, writes from New York City that she's being discharged and will be home someday this week. Well, she evidently made it right home because her and Roy were down at Libs that week. And then about Keith Harris, it said, Ensign Keith Harris has been transferred from Great Lakes, Illinois to Orange, Texas. He and his family left Saturday with Russell Wade and Kenneth Claypool, who are driving them through in the car. And then later on down in the same thing, Frank Warner was taken to an Iowa City hospital Tuesday, suffering from double pneumonia. And then, of course, I learned that he actually did get better and survived until 1952. January 26, 1946. Russell started to Texas this morning. Warren went to Marengo. Roy is quite bad. 34 degrees below zero in some parts of the state. Was 15 degrees below zero in Des Moines. Bright sunshine. The girls stayed tonight. Warren and Lena are with Roy. Russell, her youngest son, is driving the Keith Harris family to Texas. Warren, her second son, and his wife, Lena Wade, were spending time at the Marengo Hospital with her father, who was in critical condition. I wanted to show this right now. This is a picture of the Wade family. Just the Wade side, not our side. And the picture, the reason I'm showing it is Warren is in this corner right up here. And I got this off of Ancestry, and it's a woman named Cindy Wade, and she doesn't really know much about the actual family. And I'm thinking somebody in the family here, around here, has got this picture in better condition, like a glossy photo, and that I could borrow it to show or take a copy of. Russell's down here. This was taken probably 10 or 15 years. Let's see, it was 1920, so that would have been 16 years before the Diaries start. But I don't have another picture of Warren right now. That's why I was showing that. But anyway, that's just something else that I'll work on later. The girls who stayed overnight are her granddaughters, Phyllis and Judy Wade. Here's Phyllis. Phyllis later came back to North English to live in her later years, and was a really nice person. I knew her. And this is Judy, and Judy lived in Alabama. January 27th, 1946. Warrens came home, and Lena was here for a while. Her father is very bad. Harold came for me to go to Wayne's for dinner. So Walter was home, Ruth and Bill, and Wayne and Evelyn and Sue. Ruth Mall was here in the evening after I came home. I wrote a letter to Anna. So back to the picture of the grandsons again. This is Harold Wade, was her grandson who came to pick Libby up and take her around the block to her son Wayne and Jenny's house for dinner. Walter is Wayne and Jenny's son we knew as Bud Wade, who is home from the service. And according to the newspaper article that week, Walter Wade arrived home Saturday night from Great Lakes, Illinois, with his discharge from the Navy. He had been a patient at Great Lakes Hospital for a number of weeks, following a long tour of duty aboard a destroyer escort vessel. Ruth and Bill Ott were Jenny's sister and her husband. There's a picture of them. I got that from Ancestry. Wayne and Evelyn Kurtz were also, and Sue were also present. Evelyn was Wayne and Jenny's daughter. Ruth Mall was the daughter of Libby's nephew, John Josiah or Jack Mall Jr., and the mother of Betty, who married Wayne Shaw. Ruth was later married to a man named Lake Edens, so then she was known as Ruth Edens when she lived in the North English community. And Anna was Libby's only daughter, and she lived in Texas. January 28th, 1946. Suzanne stayed with me. Evelyn went to Cedar Rapids with her folks. Judy was here a while. Warren and Lena went to Marengo. Lena called Armand in Washington and Bernie in New Mexico. Basketball tournament at the school tomorrow. Hazel bought a bedroom suite in Cedar Rapids. You might remember from previous episodes that Suzanne was Libby's 3.5-year-old great-granddaughter. She was Suzanne Kurtz, the daughter of Evelyn and Wayne Kurtz. Her grandparents were Wayne or Perky and Jenny Wade. Libby's other son, Warren, and his wife, Lena Wallace Wade, were the parents of her granddaughter, Judy. Lena's father, Roy Wallace, was in critical condition at the hospital in Marengo, so Judy stayed with her grandmother a while today. Lena called her brothers Armand and Bernie, who lived out of state because her father was so bad. Hazel Wade Cobb was her newly married granddaughter who'd just gotten the new bedroom suite, and she was the bride of Glenn Cobb. Of course, I knew Hazel really well. There's a picture of Hazel and Libby. January 29th, 1946. Cloudy and not so cold. Bertha and the boys were here today. Mary R. and Hattie, too. Bertha was Libby's niece. That's my grandmother, Bertha Geringer, who just lived down the street. She brought some of her younger boys with her on her visit today. I actually looked on Beacon and found the house. It is the house that Robin and Joel Short live in. I didn't realize it was that same house. I thought there was another house in there, but it is that same house, I think. Mary Regsager was her good friend, and Hattie Newberry Killian was Mrs. Newberry's daughter, and she was also over there to visit her, do sewing projects. January 30th, 1946. Dark and cloudy in the a.m., snow and high wind in the p.m. The wind was from the northwest. 0 to 15 degrees below zero in the state. The roads are icy. Roy is about the same as before. The boys are coming home. I had a certified letter from Mary Carter. Roy Wallace was her daughter-in-law, Lena Wade's father, who was in the Marengo Hospital in bad shape. The boys here might refer to her son Russell and his friend who had gone to Texas to take Keith Harris's family down there. Mary Carter was her childhood friend who lived out of state, I think Washington State. We will see if we ever figure out what that certified letter was all about. You might have noticed Libby telling us about the weather. She was getting all of her news likely from the radio, as the family would not have owned a television set yet. January 31st, 1946. Cold and disagreeable today. Hattie was here. Sent a letter to Benton Geringer. Maud was here. Phyllis went to the store for me. Armand and Bernie came. Hattie Killian Newberry was her friend, or Newberry Killian was her friend who came to visit her sew. Maud was her nephew, Ray Claypool's wife. Yeah, I've got a picture of them here. Yeah. This is Ray and Maud. Maud was the mother of Amy Hervey of South English. I knew Maud Claypool. She lived next to my friend Helen Kirkpatrick when Helen lived in the green and white house on West Clark Street when I was a girl in the 1960s. Phyllis was Lena and Warren's oldest daughter. She was a teenager who was helping her grandmother today. And Benton Geringer was my Uncle Doc Geringer. We talked about him last week. He later lived in Williamsburg. He was stationed in Japan in 1946, and that's why Libby was writing him letters and stuff. She wrote letters to servicemen. And then Armand and Bernie was Lena's brothers from out of state. That concludes the diary portion of our program today, and then I'm going to tell you a few other things that I've learned over the week. Correspondence, etc. from November 23rd, 2024. Sharon Wilhite Hagen writes, I love hearing the history of the Claypool family. My great-grandmother was a Claypool, Lou Claypool Pettibone, and my mother was a Ballard, Grace Ballard Wilhite. The daughter of Vic and Lucille Van Dyke, Vicki Johnson, writes to say, you don't know how much this means to me. My friend Helen Kirkpatrick Sweetert of Colesburg, Iowa and Lake Placid, Florida, called to ask about Fred and Mary Regsager. You might remember Mary was Libby's friend and brought her eggs. We did a little research together. Helen was on the phone with me, and we found out that Fred was the uncle of her mom, Marilyn Regsager Kirkpatrick. Fred was also the brother of Louise Regsager Moffat, who was the grandfather of Lynn and Robert Moffat, who are around the North English area now. I'm going to stop for a drink for a second here. Tina Milhoka Claypool Milhoka from Colorado asked, where did Libby Wade live? Scott Romine gave me these aerial pictures of the house where Libby Wade lived. It was on East Oak Street. And from the older pictures, there was a building on the site. And this one, you can see it particularly. It's a big building in the center of the picture here. This picture was taken in the 1940s or maybe 1950s because the cars are older. And Scott Romine says the printouts of the pictures are not as clear as the digital images, where you can definitely tell the cars are older. In the newer picture, the apartment buildings were built. And the apartment buildings are still there. They're right there. Kind of upside down backwards. The house is right there. The large building, let's see. The Oak Street apartments were built in 1977, and Libby's house was still, Libby's house was still there then. My brother Lou lived in the house around that time, and he said that Mrs. Calvin, who was John and Chuck and Patty Calvin's grandmother, lived in the same house after Libby Wade. As for the large building that was on Main Street, between Libby's house and Main Street, Gary Miller was in here, and he said that the building was owned by Miller Hardware, and it was called the Implement Building. The reason it was called the Implement Building was because Miller Hardware sold farm implements in the early days. You might remember last week when we talked about Libby's niece Beth waiting at Libby's while her husband Harold Holmes helped Miller's with the inventory. We're still looking for a ground picture of the house where Libby Wade lived. Also, Miller Hardware changed hands. In last week's episode, that was the day that Liesl and Leland Miller and Milo Lockridge assumed ownership. And this sign says, "To the public, we wish to announce that we have purchased the N.S. Miller Hardware and now are doing business under the firm name of North English Hardware. We will continue to give the public the same satisfactory service that they have been accustomed to at N.S. Miller Hardware for the past 25 years. North English Hardware, Hardware and Farm Implements, Liesl Miller, Milo Lockridge, and Leland Miller." And Leland Miller was, of course, Gary Miller's dad. And they owned it up until into the 1960s. One of the reasons that I think everyone is enjoying these broadcasts is because one of the best ways to learn history is to share your history with others. We all remember different things, and when we share, we can learn different things. There is research on this idea, particularly by Henry Louis Gates Jr., who does the Finding Your Roots show on PBS, and other researchers. I hope to bring you more about this idea later. From now, here's an example of what I'm talking about. I know I learned to type, and I know I learned it at English Valleys. For many years, I've been teasing Don Banning, who is a board member here, and a longtime teacher at English Valleys, that thank goodness he taught me to type, because I've used that skill extensively in my life. However, I'm not sure if it was really him or Phil Ackerman who was my typing teacher. When I asked my friend Helen, she said it was Phil Ackerman who taught us. Don Manning does not remember. It is probably documented somewhere, especially since it's such recent history. But if I chose to research and find it out. But maybe we'll have to come to a consensus of who it was that taught me to type by gathering opinions from others. History is the same way. Maybe we can gather opinions from others until we find out for sure. Or maybe we will just learn little nuggets of history as we go, such as that Libby Wade grew beautiful bridal wreath bushes near her house because someone remembers it and has now passed that knowledge on to us. Speaking of knowledge, things I learned at the EV Gals Luncheon, renamed the EV Alumni Lunch on November 18th, 2024. Donna Wallace Hill, from the class of 1969, had a grandmother named Della Talley, who lived on East Clark Street, somewhere near where my grandma Tracy Geringer Wade Wallace lived, on the next block south from Libby Wade. Marilee Dillon Reesner was there. She lived out in the country, but she spent time in town at Ann Himmler's, and with her cousin Debbie Caskey, and with her grandmother Dillon, who lived at the first place west on West Clark Street on the north side of the street. Marilee would also like to see my broadcast on YouTube. You might remember that Alan Ackerman from the History Center is also interested in my broadcast being on YouTube. Kenny Foss says he has a picture of my mom, Etheldean Keller Geringer, when she went to Gritter School. And he did send it to me, and I'll get it to us another time. My friend Linda Holden Carter does not mess with Facebook, watching podcasts much, but her husband Mike Carter likes to watch, so I friended up with him. You might remember his parents, Bud and Jean Carter, were featured regarding their wedding day with Bill and Deanie Thomas last week on my broadcast. I also befriended Steve Carter, who was in the class of 1969, so that he can watch my broadcasts. Pam Kavanaugh Shield was talking about her Hohenschel ancestors and said her Hohenschel grandparents lived where you turn the corner to go north towards the greenhouse in North English by the cemetery. She also mentioned her Uncle Everett Slim Bell and his wife Marie. We remembered that Slim Bell and Max McCarter were some of the men who worked for Wayner Perky Wade, Libby's son, in his corn shelling business. Pam also remembers going to dances upstairs in the IOOF hall, which was above Johnson's Locker on Main Street, very near to Libby's house. Pam's parents were Ralph and Ruby Kavanaugh, and her grandparents were Charles and Nida Hohenschel. Pam's brother Rick Kavanaugh also remembers the fire escape coming out of the IOF hall. It was large and had heavy, round weights on it. Julie Cox Steinerson was there, and she also remembers the fire escape from the IOF hall. She said that she and Patty Aldridge spent a lot of time up there beside the fire escape. She doesn't remember Libby Wade, although she lived down the street from her. Her parents, Charles, or as we called him, Beanie Cox, and Esther Cox, lived on the corner of Oak and Bolin Streets. She does, however, remember Mary Regseger. Regsegers lived in the house where Kenny and Betty Donahue later lived, and Mary had chickens in the backyard. And Julie said her mom had a picture of Julie when she tried to run away one time when she was tiny, and she only got as far away as Mary Regseger's house 2 doors down. Julie Steinerson Cox Steinerson, said that her sister Linda Cox would have loved my podcast, as she always loved this kind of history. Julie said that her idea is that we should talk about the guys sitting on the benches uptown, as they were real characters. Perky Wade, Lisa Miller, Noah Miller. Noah Miller lived at Jan Nyman's house, and Furple White were some of them. I told her that is how my brother Tom remembers Perky, sitting on those benches uptown. I remember many things from uptown since I worked at the restaurants uptown, starting at Don and Jerry's Cafe when I was 14 years old in 1969. We'll have more on this later. Our next EV Gals Lunch, which we've renamed the EV Alumni Lunch, will be February 24th, 2025 at Bryant's at the Mall in Williamsburg at 11:30. Please contact Alice Floring Stramer for reservations. And several in this group are interested in attending the event formerly known as the Alumni Banquet, which will be held at the English Valley History Center on next July 26, 2025. July 26, 2025. There will be no dinner, but attendees can eat at the food tent or other places downtown and stop by the History Center all day. You might remember last week we talked about PFC Vaughn Sam Humphrey, who arrived in the United States. We showed the shadow box of the medals for him, and this is a newspaper article from January 10th, 1946. PFC Vaughn Sam Humphrey arrived in the States from Europe on January 3rd and received his discharge at Camp Grant, Illinois on January 10th, 1946. He is now at the home of his parents east of town. He is having a real reunion with his brother Lloyd, whom he last saw in Germany. Sam says that the North English Record arrived pretty regularly and was appreciated plenty. That just shows that how long these people were, when they were in service, they were gone from their families for a long time. The display of the week. You might have noticed behind me, there's a picture of the creamery. And here's a picture of South Iowa brand butter boxes. We've got several samples of them here. On Facebook this week, Keith Collins made a post on the Keokuk County Historical Society and Museum's Facebook page. And he said, anybody else remember getting butter in cartons like these? Growing up on the farm and milking cows, we saved the cream in a cream can, and the creamery in North English would pick up the cream a few times a week. They would leave you butter in these cartons if you needed some. And on the back it says, manufactured by English Valleys Co-op Creamery Association, North English, Iowa 52316. It's better with butter. The creamery was where they made this butter, and it was at the corner of Washington and Main Streets in North English. This is all gone now, except behind it, there's part of the little building. Several people remembered that their mothers lining the boxes that these came in and freezing peas in them because they stacked better in the freezer. Several people talked about how cream haulers picked up their cream from their farms, from their dairy cows, and talked about cream separators that was used to separate the cream from the milk. My mom worked at the creamery. So did Carl Moore's dad and Diane Bonneter's dad, Jim Bonneter. Steve Carter's mom and Gary Schultz's mom worked there, and as did Ralph Kavanaugh, the father of my friends, the Kavanaugh kids. Pam Kavanaugh Shield also remarked that it was the best butter. Harlan Spain remembered that Art Carter picked up their cream, and Alice Floring Stramer remembered Jack Lockridge was their cream hauler, and Keith Kirkpatrick, Helen and Mary's father, had a cream route. And as my friend, Mary also remembers the smell of the creamery. Gordon Troyer said, we milked cows and separated the cream and sold it to the North English Creamery. 2 of the Wilkerson brothers picked it up, and they also dropped off butter. On the Wilkerson boys, I remember Chad and Tib and Leonard and Butch hauling cream. I've also learned that the cream routes were much farther than I knew, with customers as far away as Ollie and over towards Oskaloosa. And finally, my friend Kim O'Mara said, and that's why North English's annual celebration, summer celebration, is called the Creamery Picnic. I save this one for next time. We also wanted to let you know if you are welcome to come sit and watch as we do the broadcast each week, and that we welcome your feedback. I am so glad to hear about everyone watching. It makes me want to continue. We had over 4,000 views on the first broadcast I made. This week, I heard from Debbie Claypool Sopko in Florida, who remembered seeing the picture of the Verney Claypool family on the wall at a family member's home. And also, her sister, Carolyn Claypool Atwood, gave me a shout out from Jensen Beach, Florida. Usually watching live is my brother Lou Geringer, board member Alan Ackerman, and our longtime friend Dan Best. Dave Jackson and Scott Romine from the English Valley History Center both help with the setup and props. Funding for the History Center comes from the Iowa County 100 Plus Who Care and from the Iowa County Community Foundation. However, as Dave Jackson always says when he introduces programs, we welcome your donations to keep the heat and lights on. Please send donations to the English Valley History Center, P.O. Box 70, North English, Iowa 52316. I met with Jacob Glandon after his program last week, and he agrees that we need a laptop computer dedicated to the broadcast so that we can download and show color pictures more plainly without me holding them up to the screen. We also need closed captioning so that we can reach more listeners. We'll be uploading these broadcasts to YouTube in the very near future so that we can reach more listeners. These broadcasts started when I told Dave Jackson my idea to start YouTube broadcasts to read the diaries aloud so that my thoughts and translations of the diaries would be saved for future generations if anyone was researching. I was trying to index the diaries because Aunt Lib never mentioned last names, but it was long and tedious work, and I had no hope that anyone would ever read it, so I thought about reading it aloud. Dave Jackson said, why don't you go live from the History Center on Saturday mornings? So we decided to start immediately since there's no time like the present since I'm nearly 70 years of age. Scott Romine gave us the idea to broadcast and then upload in case there is a major mistake. We were also interested in learning about English Valley's historical items that you might wish to donate to the History Center. Please contact Dave Jackson or any board member to donate. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you next week.
Good job.